The morning air over the English Channel hung heavy with salt and fuel vapor. August 17th, 1940. Oberleutnant Werner Mulders throttled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 forward, the Daimler-Benz engine roaring with the confidence of a predator. Behind him, his staffel formed up in loose formation, their aircraft gleaming in the weak sunlight. They had flown this route a dozen times before. Sweep ahead of the bombers, clear the sky of British fighters, establish air superiority. The formula had worked flawlessly over France. The Hurricane and Spitfire pilots they'd encountered in the spring had been hopelessly outmatched. The 109 could climb higher, fly faster, and dive away whenever the situation turned unfavorable. Mulders had personally witnessed British fighters struggling to reach operational altitude, their engines gasping for air, while German aircraft operated with impunity thousands of feet above them. But something felt different this morning. The intelligence reports coming back from recent sorties over Britain mentioned unusual encounters. British fighters that could suddenly climb where they couldn't before. Spitfires matching the 109's speed at 20,000 feet. Mulders dismissed it as pilot error or exaggeration. The laws of physics hadn't changed. The specifications remained the same. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 18,000 feet, Mulders spotted them. 6 Spitfires climbing directly into their path. He smiled behind his oxygen mask. The British pilots were brave but foolish. At this altitude, the advantage belonged to Germany. He signaled the attack, rolling his 109 into a diving turn. The Spitfires turned to meet them. What happened next would shatter everything Werner Mulders understood about aerial combat. The Spitfire matched his turn. Then I exceeded it. As Mulders pushed his throttle to maximum power, the British fighter not only kept pace but began to close the distance. The German pilot felt his stomach tighten. This shouldn't be possible. The performance characteristics, the engine specifications, the fuel ratings, everything in the Luftwaffe's technical manuals said this couldn't happen. Yet here it was, happening before his eyes. The Spitfire pilot executed a climbing barrel roll that should have bled away all his energy. But the British fighter emerged from the maneuver with speed to spare. Mulders broke off, diving toward the safety of the channel, his wingman struggling to keep formation. As they raced back toward France, one question burned in his mind, more urgent than any tactical consideration. What had the British changed? The answer lay in something so fundamental, so chemically simple, yet so strategically profound that it would reshape the entire trajectory of the air war. The British hadn't modified their aircraft. They hadn't installed new engines. They had changed what flowed through the fuel lines, and in doing so, had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The substance that powered every Spitfire, Hurricane, and later every American Mustang and Thunderbolt was a golden-green liquid called 100-octane aviation gasoline. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess and technical sophistication, were flying on fuel that couldn't match it. Not because they lacked the knowledge, not because their chemists were inferior, but because they had made a fundamental strategic decision rooted in Germany's geological and industrial reality, a decision that would cost them control of the skies. To understand this transformation requires stepping back from the cockpit and descending into the invisible world of molecular chemistry, industrial production, and the hard thermodynamic limits of what internal combustion engines can achieve. The story of aviation fuel in the Second World War is the story of two nations, one blessed with vast petroleum reserves and pioneering chemical engineers, the other forced to synthesize liquid fuel from coal, through processes that required enormous energy, exotic materials, and industrial infrastructure that could never match the scale of American production. It is a story where chemistry became strategy, where molecules meant the difference between victory and defeat, and where the laws of physics imposed constraints that no amount of German engineering ingenuity could overcome. The concept of octane rating had been established in 1927 by American chemist Graham Edgar. He created a measurement system using two reference fuels, iso-octane, which resisted premature ignition, and N-heptane, which detonated easily under pressure. Pure iso-octane received a rating of 100. Pure N-heptane received a 0. Any fuel's octane number represented its knock resistance compared to these standards. When fuel detonates prematurely in an engine cylinder, a phenomenon called knock or detonation, it creates a shock wave that can destroy pistons, damage valves, and ultimately cause catastrophic engine failure. The higher the octane rating, the more compression and boost pressure an engine could tolerate without this destructive detonation. For aircraft engines, this mattered enormously. Higher compression ratios meant more power from the same displacement. Superchargers could force more air into cylinders, but only if the fuel could withstand the increased pressure and temperature without detonating. An engine designed for 87-octane fuel might produce 700 horsepower. That same engine running on 100-octane fuel could produce over 1,000 horsepower simply by increasing the boost pressure. The aircraft wouldn't be faster or more maneuverable because of better aerodynamics or lighter construction. It would dominate because chemical bonds in the fuel molecules allowed thermodynamic processes that lower-grade fuel couldn't sustain. By the mid-1930s, most nations operated their aircraft on fuel, ranging from 78 to 87 octane. The RAF used 80 to 87 octane fuel. The Luftwaffe used 87 octane. American military aircraft, bound by the same economic logic that governed civilian automotive fuel, operated on similar grades. Everyone understood that higher octane fuels offered performance advantages, but the cost seemed prohibitive. Producing 100-octane aviation gasoline in 1935 required complex chemical processes that made each gallon cost over 100 times more than standard automotive gasoline, roughly $30 per gallon when ordinary gasoline sold for 20 cents. The economic barrier appeared insurmountable. Aircraft engine manufacturers needed high-octane fuel to justify designing more powerful engines. Fuel refiners needed guaranteed large-volume customers to justify building the expensive infrastructure for high-octane production. Neither side could move first without the other. The impasse might have continued indefinitely, except for one man who occupied a unique position, someone who understood both the engineering requirements of high-performance aircraft and the political industrial mechanisms necessary to create markets where none existed. James Harold Doolittle had earned one of the first doctoral degrees in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1925. He'd won the Schneider Trophy race, set the world's land-plane speed record, and pioneered instrument flying techniques. In 1930, he left active military service and joined Shell Oil Company as manager of their aviation fuels division. Doolittle possessed the technical knowledge to understand what high-octane fuel could do for aircraft performance, the fame and connections to influence military procurement decisions, and the position within a major oil company to drive production capacity development. Throughout the mid-1930s, Doolittle conducted a relentless campaign. He lobbied Army Air Corps leadership, demonstrated aircraft performance using Shell's limited supplies of 100-octane fuel, and argued that American military aviation needed to standardize on higher-grade fuel. In 1938, his efforts succeeded. The U.S. Army Air Corps and Navy agreed to make 100-octane fuel their standard. Suddenly, a market existed, but producing millions of gallons economically required solving the chemistry problem that had made high-octane fuel prohibitively expensive. The solution arrived through a French chemical engineer named Eugene Jules Houdry. Born in France in 1892, Houdry had initially worked on converting coal into gasoline, a problem that would become critically important for Germany, but would be solved very differently by American engineers. After immigrating to the United States in 1931, Houdry began working with Sun Oil Company on a revolutionary approach to petroleum refining. Previous methods of producing high-octane components involved expensive, time-consuming chemical processes. Houdry developed a catalytic cracking process that used regenerated catalysts to transform vaporized petroleum into high-octane gasoline components, far more efficiently than earlier techniques. The Houdry process worked by heating crude oil fractions in the presence of solid catalyst materials, typically aluminum silicate compounds. These catalysts accelerated the breaking down of long-chain hydrocarbons into shorter, more volatile molecules that possessed better anti-knock characteristics. The process could extract substantially more high-octane components from each barrel of crude oil. Where conventional refining might yield 18 gallons of aviation-grade gasoline from a 42-gallon barrel, the Houdry process could produce 34 gallons. More importantly, it could do so at a cost that made 100-octane fuel economically viable for military use. By 1939, the price had dropped to just pennies more than standard automotive gasoline. The first large-scale Houdry process plant came online in 1940. Its timing proved providential. In Europe, the war that German military planners had anticipated was already underway. France fell in June. The Battle of Britain began in July. And the Royal Air Force, equipped with Merlin engines designed to use 87-octane fuel, faced a Luftwaffe that had demonstrated air superiority over the continent. Britain's survival depended on maintaining control of its airspace. The mathematics of aerial combat suggested this might not be possible. German fighters held measurable performance advantages. British production couldn't match German numbers. The strategic calculus pointed toward defeat. Then, in June 1939, the first bulk shipment of 100-octane fuel arrived in Britain from the Esso refinery in Aruba. Additional tanker convoys followed from Curaçao and American refineries. The British government stockpiled these shipments while RAF fighter squadrons continued operating on 87-octane fuel. The decision to delay conversion involved complex considerations of supply security, engine modification requirements, and the strategic necessity of building sufficient reserves before committing to the new fuel standard. By March 1940, Fighter Command began converting its engines to operate on 100-octane fuel. The conversion process required more than simply filling tanks with higher-grade fuel. Engine boost limits needed adjustment. Cockpit instruments required recalibration. Pilots needed training on new emergency power settings. Maintenance crews studied revised procedures. The technical modifications were straightforward, but implementing them across an entire fighter force while maintaining operational readiness demanded careful planning. The initial boost increase raised maximum manifold pressure from 6 pounds to 9 pounds, delivering approximately 130 additional horsepower at rated altitude. This represented roughly a 15% power increase, enough to transform the tactical capabilities of every British fighter, but not so extreme as to cause reliability problems. By May 1940, roughly 25% of Fighter Command had converted to 100-octane operations. Germany invaded the Low Countries on May 10th.
The air battles that followed over Belgium and northern France exposed the Luftwaffe to the first RAF fighters running on 100-octane fuel, but the encounters remained inconclusive. The overall strategic situation, German numerical superiority, superior tactical position, the collapse of French resistance, overshadowed individual technical advantages. Luftwaffe pilots reported no particular change in British fighter performance. Their confidence remained unshaken. The assessment that had proven accurate over France still held. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 maintained clear superiority over the Hurricane and Spitfire. This assessment would not survive contact with the sustained air battle that began over Britain in July 1940. The Luftwaffe flew into that battle with the same fuel that had powered its victories across Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France. German pilots expected the same performance advantages that had characterized every air combat engagement since 1939. Instead, they discovered that the fundamental thermodynamic equation governing aerial combat had shifted. The British fighters that had struggled to compete in May could suddenly match or exceed German performance in August. The change wasn't subtle or disputed. It was measurable, repeatable, and undeniable. Werner Milder's experience over the Channel wasn't an anomaly. Squadron after squadron returned with similar reports. The Spitfires climbed faster. The Hurricanes accelerated harder. The performance gap that had given the Luftwaffe tactical initiative had vanished. German intelligence struggled to explain it. Captured British pilots wouldn't or couldn't provide answers beyond vague references to modifications. Luftwaffe technical officers examined crashed British aircraft, but found no revolutionary changes to airframes or engines. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more strategically devastating than any mechanical innovation. The British had changed what burned in their cylinders, and Germany couldn't match it. The reason lay buried in the fundamental chemistry of fuel production and the geological realities that shaped each nation's industrial capacity. The United States possessed vast petroleum reserves, 1.35 billion barrels of annual production in 1940, representing 63% of global output. California alone produced 203 million barrels yearly. Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana contained fields so prolific that peacetime production had to be artificially limited to prevent price collapse. When war came, American refineries didn't need to invent new sources of petroleum. They needed to modify existing crude oil through better refining processes to extract more high-octane components. This was a straightforward engineering challenge, difficult, expensive, requiring massive investment in new refining equipment, but fundamentally solvable using existing technology and abundant feedstock. Germany faced an entirely different problem. The nation possessed virtually no petroleum reserves. Small fields at Niagara and Akita produced negligible quantities. Before the war, Germany imported 90% of its oil requirements. The British naval blockade established in 1939 cut access to global petroleum markets. Romania's Ploiești oil fields provided some supply, but these were vulnerable to interdiction and couldn't meet German military requirements. Austria-Hungary and other potential suppliers had limited excess capacity. Germany's strategic situation left only one option: synthesize liquid fuel from the one resource the nation possessed in abundance: coal. The technology for converting coal into liquid fuels had been pioneered by German chemists Friedrich Bergius and Franz Fischer, working independently in the 1920s. The Bergius process, also called direct coal hydrogenation, involved combining pulverized coal with hydrogen gas at extremely high temperatures and pressures, between 400 and 600 degrees Celsius, at pressures ranging from 200 to 700 atmospheres. This represented pressures exceeding 10,000 pounds per square inch,
requiring special steel alloys that could resist hydrogen embrittlement at elevated temperatures. Catalyst materials like tungsten sulfide, nickel sulfide, or tin compounds accelerated the reactions that broke apart coal's molecular structure and recombined the carbon and hydrogen into liquid hydrocarbons resembling petroleum. The Fischer-Tropsch process used a different approach. Instead of directly hydrogenating coal, it first gasified coal into synthesis gas, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. This gas was then passed over catalysts at lower pressures and temperatures to synthesize liquid fuels. The FT process produced excellent diesel fuel and lubricating oils, but generated lower quality gasoline that required extensive upgrading. The Burgess hydrogenation method produced better aviation gasoline, which gave it strategic priority in German fuel production planning. By 1940, Germany operated 14 hydrogenation plants producing 72,000 barrels per day. The largest facilities were at Leuna and Perlitz, massive industrial complexes requiring enormous coal inputs and electrical power. The fuel they produced, designated B4, had an octane rating of 87 to 91 using the lean mixture measurement and approximately 100 using the rich mixture measurement. This was respectable fuel by pre-war standards. It powered the Luftwaffe's victories in the war's opening phases, but it couldn't match what the Americans and British were developing. Germany had a higher grade fuel called C3. This was B4 fuel enhanced with iso-octane additives, raising its octane rating to 94 to 97 lean and 100 to 130 rich mixture. C3 represented the best fuel German chemistry could produce, roughly equivalent to Allied 100 octane standard. But producing C3 required iso-octane, which had to be synthesized through an elaborate multi-stage process. Coal was gasified with steam and oxygen in Lurgi gasifiers. The resulting gas was scrubbed of sulfur and other contaminants using ammonia. Pressure swing absorption adjusted the gas composition, which was then passed over chromium catalysts to produce butanol. The butanol underwent dehydration to form N-butene, which was then polymerized into iso-octane. Each stage required specialized equipment, skilled operators, and substantial energy input. The butene needed for iso-octane production was also required for synthetic rubber, Buna N and Buna S, which Germany desperately needed since the British blockade cut access to natural rubber. This created impossible resource allocation decisions. Every ton of butene used for high-octane fuel was a ton unavailable for rubber production. German planners could never produce enough C3 to supply the entire Luftwaffe. Most German fighters flew on B4. Only selected front-line units received C3, and even they couldn't always get it in sufficient quantities. The entire German Air Force never standardized on their best available fuel. They couldn't afford to. Meanwhile, American production capacity was expanding at rates that defied German intelligence estimates. In 1940, U.S. refineries produced 40,000 barrels per day of 100-octane aviation gasoline. By 1941, this had increased to 145,000 barrels per day. In 1942, 292,000 barrels per day. By 1943, 414,000 barrels per day. The peak came in 1945 at 514,000 barrels per day, nearly 7 times the 1940 output. At war's end, Allied aviation fuel production reached 25 million gallons per day. Total wartime production exceeded 9.7 billion gallons. Consider those numbers in context. Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry, both hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch plants combined, produced roughly 124,000 barrels per day at peak output in 1943.
This represented about 50% of Germany's total petroleum needs and 90% of Luftwaffe aviation fuel. American production of just 100-octane aviation gasoline, not total fuel production, just the high-grade aviation fuel, exceeded 500,000 barrels per day by war's end. The United States was producing more than 4 times as much premium aviation fuel as Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry generated total output, and American production came from crude oil that required far less energy input than German coal synthesis. The energy economics were brutal. The Bergius process consumed enormous quantities of coal to produce relatively small amounts of liquid fuel. The chemical energy in the coal significantly exceeded the energy content of the resulting gasoline. Every gallon of German synthetic fuel represented wasted energy that could have powered factories, heated homes, or fueled locomotives. The process worked, but it was thermodynamically inefficient in ways that peacetime economics would never tolerate. Only wartime necessity and state subsidies made it viable. Hitler had declared the production cost of synthetic fuel of no importance. This was strategically necessary, but economically devastating. Every Reichsmark spent on synthetic fuel infrastructure couldn't be spent on aircraft production, weapons development, or other military requirements. American refineries faced no such trade-offs. Crude oil arrived continuously from domestic fields via pipeline, rail, and tanker. The Haudry process and its derivatives, fluid catalytic cracking, alkylation, hydroforming, extracted more high-octane components from each barrel than previous refining methods. These processes weren't energy neutral. They required substantial heat and pressure, but they started with crude oil that already contained the hydrogen-carbon chains needed for gasoline. They were rearranging and optimizing existing molecules, not synthesizing them from elemental components. The thermodynamic efficiency vastly exceeded coal hydrogenation. One refinery complex alone, Jersey Standard's Baytown and Baton Rouge plants, delivered 2 billion gallons of 100-octane fuel by June 1945. Chevron's California operations produced over 1 billion gallons. These were individual companies, not entire national industries. The scale differential between American petroleum refining and German synthetic fuel production represented one of the fundamental asymmetries that shaped the air war's outcome. But quantity alone doesn't explain the qualitative impact. The question isn't simply how much fuel each side produced, but what that fuel enabled their aircraft to do. The performance difference between 87-octane B4 and 130-octane fuel manifested in specific, measurable ways. A Rolls-Royce Merlin engine using 87-octane fuel produced approximately 1,050 horsepower. The same engine running on 100-octane fuel produced 1,280 horsepower. By war's end, running on 150-grade fuel, which was actually 110-octane lean, 150 performance number rich, the Merlin generated 1,600 horsepower. The engine hadn't changed fundamentally. Its displacement, bore, stroke, and basic architecture remained constant. What changed was the thermodynamic ceiling imposed by fuel chemistry. This translated directly into combat capability. A Spitfire Mark using 87-octane fuel had a maximum speed of approximately 340 miles per hour. By 1944, the Spitfire Mark XIV running on 150-grade fuel could exceed 425 miles per hour. The rate of climb improved proportionally. The service ceiling increased by thousands of feet. Acceleration in combat maneuvers, the ability to convert potential energy into kinetic energy, to climb and turn and dive, all improved because the fuel allowed higher boost pressures without detonation. German fighters couldn't keep pace. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 ran on B-4 fuel throughout most of the war. Late war variants designed for C-3 fuel rarely received it in combat conditions. When they did, C-3 brought German fighters to approximate parity with earlier Allied standards, roughly equivalent to 100 octane. But by the time Germany was producing limited quantities of Super C-3 with performance numbers approaching 150, Allied forces were already operating on 150 grade fuel as standard. Germany was always one generation behind in fuel technology, never quite closing the gap, perpetually constrained by the fundamental inefficiency of coal synthesis versus petroleum refining. The American aviation fuel advantage extended beyond fighters to every aircraft type. Bombers used the same 100-octane fuel. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone and R-2800 double Wasp radial engines, the Allison V-1710, the Packard-built Merlin. All these engines were designed from the outset to operate on 100 octane or better. They used higher compression ratios, more aggressive supercharger boost, and power settings that would destroy engines running on lower-grade fuel. A B-17 Flying Fortress with 4 Wright R-1820 engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower on 102-octane fuel, could carry bomb loads and defensive armament that wouldn't be possible with 87-octane fuel. Range increased because the same fuel load produced more power per unit consumed. The entire operational envelope of American and British air power expanded because molecular chemistry allowed thermodynamic processes that German fuel couldn't sustain. This is the part of the story where many histories focus on the tactical outcomes. The dogfights won, the bomber formations protected, the ground targets destroyed. But to understand the true significance requires examining what happened inside German strategic planning as the fuel gap became undeniable. German aeronautical engineers understood octane chemistry as well as anyone. They knew exactly what high-octane fuel could do. The question wasn't whether to pursue it, but whether they could produce it in militarily relevant quantities given Germany's resource constraints and industrial capacity. The answer was devastating in its clarity. No, not because of scientific limitations, not because German chemists lacked knowledge, but because coal synthesis imposed energy costs and resource requirements that Germany's war economy couldn't absorb while simultaneously maintaining aircraft production, weapons development, and general military operations. Every ton of coal that went into fuel synthesis was a ton unavailable for steel production or electrical generation. Every engineer working in a hydrogenation plant was an engineer not designing weapons or improving existing systems. Every Reichsmark spent on synthetic fuel infrastructure was investment capital unavailable for other purposes. German planners understood this dilemma. They made rational decisions based on available resources and strategic priorities. They expanded coal hydrogenation capacity as quickly as practical constraints allowed. They developed C-3 and Super C-3 for critical applications. They prioritized fuel distribution to front-line units and important missions. None of it was enough. The thermodynamic inefficiency of producing liquid fuel from coal, a process that consumed more energy than it produced, meant that Germany could never match the scale of American petroleum refining. The laws of chemistry and thermodynamics imposed hard limits that no amount of German engineering skill could overcome. This realization slowly permeated German military and industrial leadership throughout 1941 and 1942. Intelligence reports confirmed that Allied aircraft were operating on fuel superior to anything Germany could provide. Captured British and American aircraft were tested using German fuel. The results showed immediate performance degradation. The reverse test, running German aircraft on captured Allied fuel, demonstrated what Luftwaffe aircraft could theoretically achieve if fuel limitations didn't exist.
Every test confirmed the same conclusion. German aviation was operating under a handicap imposed not by inferior aircraft design but by inferior fuel chemistry. The strategic implications extended beyond individual aircraft performance. Fuel shortages affected training. New Luftwaffe pilots received fewer flight hours than their Allied counterparts because Germany couldn't afford to consume precious high-grade fuel on training flights. This created a skill gap that compounded the technological disadvantage. Even when German aircraft theoretically matched Allied specifications, the pilots flying them were less experienced, less prepared, and less capable of exploiting whatever performance advantages remained. The situation deteriorated further as Allied strategic bombing targeted German synthetic fuel plants. The Ploiești refineries in Romania were destroyed by American bombers in 1944. The Leuna, Pellets, and other major hydrogenation plants suffered repeated attacks. German production capacity declined steadily from 1944 onward. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, fuel shortages had become so critical that German armored units ran out of gasoline mid-offensive. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft not from combat losses but from simple lack of fuel. The theoretical performance of German jet engines, Junkers Jumo 004 and BMW 003 turbojets that didn't require high-octane fuel, couldn't overcome the reality that there wasn't enough fuel of any grade to sustain operations. The human dimension of this fuel disparity manifested in ways that raw production statistics cannot capture. Consider the experience of a Luftwaffe pilot stationed in France in the summer of 1943. His Focke-Wulf FW-190A ran on B-4 fuel when available, occasionally C-3 when priorities allowed. He'd been trained to respect the aircraft's performance envelope, boost limitations calculated for 87 octane fuel, temperature restrictions, manifold pressure limits beyond which engine damage would occur. These weren't arbitrary restrictions. They represented hard thermodynamic boundaries imposed by fuel chemistry. Then he encounters an American P-47 Thunderbolt. The Republic fighter carries a single pilot and 8 50 caliber machine guns in a package weighing over 7 tons fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine displaces 2,800 cubic inches and normally produces 2,000 horsepower. With water methanol injection and war emergency power settings enabled by 130 octane fuel, it can briefly generate 2,300 horsepower. The Thunderbolt pilot can engage emergency power, exceed all normal boost limits, and push his engine to performance levels that would destroy a German engine in minutes. Then he can sustain this for the duration of combat, disengage at will using superior speed, and return to base with an engine that will be ready for the next mission after routine maintenance. The German pilot has no equivalent option. His fuel won't sustain those power levels. Pushing beyond design limits means engine failure, not hypothetically, but immediately and catastrophically. The thermodynamic ceiling is absolute. He can fly perfectly, execute ideal tactics, possess superior situational awareness, and still find himself unable to match the American's performance because chemistry limits what his engine can do. This isn't a contest of skill or courage. It's a contest of molecular bonds, of activation energies, of the maximum compression ratio that fuel octane rating can sustain without premature detonation. Multiply this individual encounter across thousands of engagements over years of combat, and the cumulative effect becomes strategically decisive. German fighters could still win individual battles through tactical surprise, numerical concentration, or pilot skill. But the average engagement increasingly favored Allied aircraft because fuel chemistry gave them inherent performance advantages that tactics couldn't overcome. The Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness from 1943 onward resulted from multiple factors: pilot attrition, production shortages, strategic overextension, but fuel limitations imposed a handicap that affected every single sortie. The evidence of American industrial capacity reached German forces through channels beyond aerial combat. Captured supply dumps revealed fuel storage on scales that seemed impossible. When German troops overran American forward airfields during the Battle of the Bulge, they discovered fuel stockpiles exceeding anything in Luftwaffe experience. Thousands of barrels of 130-octane fuel, cached at forward positions for tactical convenience, representing more high-grade aviation fuel than some entire Luftwaffe fighter wings received in a month. The visual impact was profound. The tactical manuals were one thing. Abstract discussions of enemy capabilities, production statistics, intelligence estimates. But seeing physical evidence of abundance on this scale confronted German soldiers with the material reality of what they faced. Some captured American aircraft were fueled with German B-4 and tested in flight. The performance degradation was immediate and measurable. A P-51 Mustang running on German fuel lost approximately 60 miles per hour of maximum speed. The rate of climb declined by over 500 feet per minute. The service ceiling dropped by several thousand feet. The same aircraft on American 130-octane fuel performed as specified, superior to anything in German inventory. The tests confirmed what German engineers already knew. Their aircraft weren't fundamentally inferior in design. They were handicapped by fuel that couldn't support the same power outputs Allied engines achieved routinely. This knowledge created a strange psychological burden for German aviators and engineers. They understood the problem. They knew the solution. The chemistry wasn't mysterious. Producing high-octane fuel required processes that German scientists had helped pioneer. Eugene Houdry's catalytic cracking built on fundamental research conducted by German chemists. The theoretical knowledge resided in Germany. What Germany lacked was petroleum feedstock and the industrial capacity to refine it at American scales. This wasn't a problem engineering could solve. It was a problem of geological reality and resource availability. Germany could build better aircraft, train better pilots, develop superior tactics. And all of it ran on fuel that imposed performance ceilings Allied forces didn't experience. The desperation this created drove several alternative approaches. German engineers developed direct fuel injection systems for aircraft engines earlier than most other nations, partly because injection could extract marginally better performance from lower octane fuel than carburation. They experimented extensively with water methanol injection, which cooled intake charges and allowed temporarily higher boost pressures even with B4 fuel. They designed engines with features that maximized efficiency at lower compression ratios. These were all rational engineering responses to fuel limitations. None of them eliminated the fundamental handicap. The jet engine development program gained urgency partly because jets didn't require high-octane fuel. The Junkers Jumo 004 and BMW 003 turbojets could run on kerosene-type fuels that Germany could produce more easily than high-octane gasoline. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter promised performance that no piston engine aircraft could match, independent of fuel octane ratings. But jet development faced its own material constraints. Exotic metals for turbine blades, precision manufacturing for tight tolerances, pilot training for entirely new flight characteristics. By the time jets entered operational service in late 1944, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where even technological superiority in specific weapons couldn't reverse the overall trajectory. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Meanwhile, Allied fuel production continued expanding. By 1944,
American refineries were producing not just 100-octane fuel, but 150 grade, actually 110-octane lean mixture, 150 performance number rich mixture. British refineries produced similar grades. The entire Allied Air Force operated on fuel that exceeded German capabilities by margins that kept widening. A late-war Spitfire. Mark 13th on 150 grade fuel could generate 1,600 horsepower from its Merlin engine. German fighters using C-3 at maximum boost might reach 1,400 horsepower briefly, but couldn't sustain it and rarely had access to C-3 anyway. The strategic bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel plants accelerated this disparity. American and British bombers struck the Leuna plant repeatedly in May and June 1944. The Pöhlitz facility suffered similar attacks. The Fischer-Tropsch plants in the Ruhr region were targeted systematically. German engineers and slave laborers worked frantically to repair damage, but each raid set production back further. By mid-1944, German synthetic fuel output had declined roughly half of peak capacity. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht competed for shrinking fuel supplies. Entire panzer divisions sat immobile for lack of fuel. Fighter squadrons grounded aircraft because allocating fuel to training or to less critical missions couldn't be justified. The human cost of these fuel shortages manifested in ways that statistics cannot fully convey. Luftwaffe pilot training hours declined precipitously from 1943 onward. A German fighter pilot entering combat in 1944 might have 150 hours of flight time. His American or British counterpart typically had 250 to 300 hours. The experience gap widened throughout 1944 and 1945 as American training programs expanded, while German programs contracted under fuel constraints. New Luftwaffe pilots died at appalling rates, not from inferior aircraft or tactics, but from insufficient training driven by fuel scarcity. Consider the mechanics of this training shortfall. Learning to fly a high-performance fighter requires dozens of hours practicing basic maneuvers, then dozens more mastering combat techniques. Formation flying, gunnery, navigation, instrument flight, emergency procedures. Each skill demands practice time that consumes fuel. German training programs cut hours not because instructors believed less training was adequate, but because fuel literally didn't exist to support longer programs. They sent pilots into combat knowing those pilots lacked the proficiency that adequate training would provide. The alternative, not sending them at all, meant squadrons without pilots. Either choice led to the same outcome, just along different timelines. The experienced Luftwaffe pilots who survived into 1944 faced a different calculus. They understood that every combat sortie might be their last, not just from enemy action, but from fuel shortages preventing future missions. The psychological burden of fighting under these constraints, knowing you're outnumbered, outperformed, and that even if you survive today, there may not be fuel for tomorrow's mission, wore down morale in ways that abstract strategic analyses miss. Some veterans recorded impressions of fighting not just Allied pilots, but Allied industrial capacity, facing an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources while their own supplies contracted monthly. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 demonstrated the ultimate consequences of fuel shortage. German armor achieved tactical surprise and initial success, advancing rapidly through American lines in the Ardennes forest. Then they ran out of fuel. Panzer divisions that should have pressed their advantage found themselves immobilized. The Luftwaffe managed brief periods of intense activity during the battle's opening days but couldn't sustain operations. Weather that grounded Allied aircraft initially worked in Germany's favor, but when skies cleared and American fighters and bombers returned in force, the Luftwaffe's response was limited not by aircraft availability but by fuel.
German commanders captured or killed during the battle's later phases often had fuel shortages among their first explanations for the offensive's failure. The irony wasn't lost on German petroleum engineers. They had pioneered coal synthesis. They had developed sophisticated hydrogenation processes. German chemical engineering was world-class. Under different circumstances, with access to petroleum reserves comparable to American resources, German fuel production might have matched Allied output. But circumstances weren't different. Germany possessed abundant coal and negligible petroleum. The United States possessed petroleum reserves that dwarfed all other nations combined. Chemistry could convert coal to liquid fuel, but it couldn't change the fundamental energy balance that made petroleum refining vastly more efficient than coal synthesis. By war's end, the numbers told a story of a symmetry so extreme it bordered on absurdity. The United States had produced over 9.7 billion gallons of aviation gasoline between 1942 and 1945. Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry, both aviation fuel and other products, had generated perhaps 3 billion gallons total across all war years. American production of high-octane aviation fuel alone exceeded 3 times Germany's complete synthetic fuel output. And American production came from renewable petroleum sources, while German production consumed irreplaceable coal stocks at rates that would be economically unsustainable in peacetime. The individual human stories that emerged from this statistical gulf reveal much about how participants experienced the war. American pilots rarely thought about fuel. It was simply available, in training, in combat, at forward bases, anywhere aircraft operated. The logistics system that delivered millions of gallons across oceans and continents functioned so reliably that fuel availability became an assumption rather than a constraint. American pilots could practice maneuvers repeatedly, could fly training missions that consumed thousands of gallons, could operate at maximum performance knowing fuel reserves wouldn't be exhausted. German pilots lived in a different reality. Fuel availability was never certain. Training flights were rationed. Combat operations were carefully planned around fuel budgets. The luxury of extended patrol time or multiple practice runs simply didn't exist for most units most of the time. This created a psychological environment where every gallon of fuel represented strategic value, where wasting fuel through inefficient flying or unnecessary operations wasn't just poor airmanship, but resource misallocation with strategic implications. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied technical teams conducted extensive surveys of German synthetic fuel facilities. The Technical Oil Mission examined surviving plants, interviewed German engineers and scientists, and confiscated thousands of technical documents. What they discovered confirmed pre-war assessments. German coal synthesis technology was sophisticated and effective within its constraints. The Bergius and Fischer-Tropsch processes worked. They produced usable fuel. Under conditions where petroleum access was impossible, coal synthesis provided a viable alternative. But the energy economics were brutal. The process consumed far more energy than it produced. It required specialized equipment, exotic materials, and enormous industrial infrastructure. It was economically justifiable only under wartime conditions where cost became irrelevant compared to strategic necessity. Some American politicians and oil industry representatives suggested the United States should build demonstration coal synthesis plants to reduce dependence on petroleum. The idea went nowhere. With abundant domestic petroleum production and efficient refining capacity, American industry had no incentive to pursue expensive, energy-intensive coal synthesis. The Bureau of Mines eventually established a small experimental facility in Louisiana, Missouri, using captured German equipment and documents, but it remained a research project rather than a production facility. The fundamental economics that made coal synthesis uncompetitive with petroleum refining in peacetime reasserted themselves immediately after the war. German synthetic fuel plants faced immediate dismantling orders under Allied occupation plans. The facilities at Leuna, Pulitz, and other sites were designated for destruction to prevent Germany from rebuilding war-making capacity. Some plants in the Soviet occupation zone continued operating to supply Russian needs, but most were deactivated. The massive infrastructure investments, the high-pressure reactors, catalyst production facilities, coal gasification plants became obsolete overnight. The knowledge remained. The technical documents survived, but the strategic necessity that justified building and operating the plants disappeared with Germany's defeat. The legacy of the aviation fuel race shaped post-war aeronautical development in lasting ways. American and British engine designers continued optimizing for high-octane fuel availability. The assumption that 100 octane or better fuel would always be available influenced engine architecture, compression ratios, supercharger design, and performance specifications. This created path dependencies that persisted for decades. Piston engines continued using high-octane avgas well into the jet age. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider flew combat missions in Vietnam during the 1960s and early 70s running on 115-grade fuel, a direct descendant of wartime formulations. Navy T-28 trainers operated on high-octane fuel into the 1980s. The environmental and health consequences of tetraethyl lead, the additive primarily responsible for raising octane ratings, weren't fully understood during the war. Leaded fuel produced toxic exhaust emissions. Ground crews, pilots, and people living near airports experienced lead exposure. The long-term health effects accumulated slowly, becoming apparent only years after the war. Modern aviation fuel regulations mandate reduced lead content or unleaded alternatives, but the transition has been slow because so many existing aircraft engines were designed assuming leaded high-octane fuel availability. The chemical choices made under wartime pressure created dependencies that lasted generations. For Germany, the fuel shortage's lessons influenced post-war strategic thinking in complicated ways. The recognition that resource constraints could impose absolute limits on military capability, regardless of technological sophistication or tactical skill, shaped how German military theorists and historians analyzed the war's outcome. Some emphasized material factors, American industrial capacity, petroleum reserves, refining technology, as decisive elements that German strategy couldn't overcome. Others focused on the mismatch between Germany's strategic ambitions and its resource base, arguing that the war was unwinnable from the start given these asymmetries. The truth likely incorporates both perspectives. Germany entered a war that required resources it didn't possess and couldn't acquire. Coal synthesis provided partial mitigation, but couldn't close the gap. Superior German engineering in specific areas, jet engines, rockets, some aircraft designs, couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages in fuel chemistry, production capacity, and raw material access. The war became a contest between German efficiency and Allied abundance, and abundance won. Individual participants carried their own understandings forward. Werner Mulders, the Luftwaffe ace who encountered those inexplicably improved Spitfires over the Channel in August 1940, didn't survive to see the war's end. He died in an aircraft accident in November 1941. But he had shared his observations with fellow pilots and superiors. The reports of British fighters performing beyond expected specifications contributed to German intelligence assessments that eventually identified fuel as a key factor. Other pilots who did survive, who flew the entire arc from early victories through middle war stalemate to late war defeat, carried memories of how the tactical balance shifted as fuel quality and availability declined. American pilots and ground crews had different memories. They remembered abundance, fuel trucks that never ran empty, supply chains that delivered consistently, the freedom to operate at maximum performance without resource anxiety. Some recognized this as exceptional, understanding that their experience differed fundamentally from enemy aviators.
Others simply accepted abundance as normal, never fully grasping how unusual their situation was. The contrast reveals much about how resource availability shapes not just military capability, but the psychological environment in which people experience war. The fuel story also illuminates broader patterns in how nations mobilize industrial capacity during total war. American petroleum production increased by 30% from 1940 to 1945, despite diverting enormous resources to military production in other sectors. Refineries expanded capacity while also improving yield, extracting more high-octane components per barrel through better processes. The workforce expanded to include hundreds of thousands of women who filled positions left by men entering military service. The entire petroleum industry operated at maximum sustainable output for years, demonstrating industrial flexibility that matched military requirements with available technology and resources. Germany's synthetic fuel program demonstrated different patterns: centralized planning, state subsidies for economically inefficient processes, forced labor supplementing skilled workers, allocation decisions driven by military necessity rather than economic optimization. The program succeeded in producing fuel where none would otherwise exist, but it consumed resources that had alternative uses and never scaled to meet total requirements. The contrast between voluntary industrial expansion under market incentives plus government contracts, American Petroleum, versus state-directed synthesis under resource constraints, German coal to liquid, produced dramatically different outcomes measured by both quantity and efficiency. These outcomes weren't predetermined by ideology or national character. They resulted from specific material circumstances, petroleum availability, existing industrial infrastructure, access to global resources, technological maturity, interacting with strategic decisions about resource allocation. Different circumstances might have produced different results, but the circumstances that actually existed in 1939 to 1945 created conditions where American petroleum abundance and German petroleum scarcity became strategically decisive. The technical accomplishments on both sides deserve recognition separate from strategic outcomes. German engineers solved extraordinarily difficult problems in coal synthesis, operating chemical processes at pressures and temperatures that required materials, science innovations, and process control sophistication. American petroleum engineers revolutionized refining technology, developing catalytic processes that dramatically increased high-octane yield. Both achievements represented genuine advances in chemical engineering. The difference lay in what feedstock they started with and what efficiency they could achieve given that starting point. In the end, the story of aviation fuel. The Second World War exemplifies how chemistry becomes strategy, how molecular properties translate into combat capability, and how resource constraints impose limits that skill and determination cannot overcome. A German pilot, flying a technically sophisticated fighter on 87-octane fuel, faced thermodynamic limits that prevented matching an Allied pilot flying a comparable aircraft on 130-octane fuel. No amount of courage, tactical brilliance, or engineering refinement could change the activation energy required to combust fuel without premature detonation. The chemistry was absolute. The men who fought didn't experience this as chemistry. They experienced it as performance differentials, as tactical disadvantages, as missions that couldn't be flown and battles that couldn't be won.
They experienced it through accumulated frustrations of facing opponents who seemed to possess limitless resources while their own supplies contracted. They experienced it in the knowledge that their best efforts operated under handicaps that the enemy didn't face. This human dimension, the lived experience of fighting under material constraints, adds emotional resonance to statistics that might otherwise remain abstract. Werner Mulder's surprise that morning over the Channel in August of 1940 encapsulated the moment when German airmen discovered their assumed superiority was evaporating. The tactical advantage they'd enjoyed over Poland, France, and Norway had rested partly on better aircraft and tactics, but also on fuel parity. Everyone flew on roughly equivalent octane ratings in the war's opening phase. Once Britain converted to 100-octane operations, that parity vanished. The performance gap only widened as American production expanded and German capacity contracted under strategic bombing pressure. The final accounting reveals numbers almost too large to comprehend. 20 billion gallons represents approximately 80 billion quarts, or enough fuel to fill roughly 47,000 Olympic swimming pools. Spread across the war's duration, this meant Allied forces consumed roughly 13 million gallons of aviation fuel daily on average, with peaks far exceeding that. Every gallon represented refined crude oil, transported across oceans or continents, distributed to forward bases, loaded into aircraft, and burned in engines that converted chemical energy into mechanical power that turned propellers, lifted bombers, powered fighters, and supported the entire apparatus of aerial warfare. Germany never approached these figures. They couldn't. The thermodynamic efficiency of petroleum refining versus coal synthesis imposed ratios that no amount of German industrial capability could overcome. Even if every hydrogenation plant operated at maximum capacity without interruption, which none did after mid-1944 due to bombing, German synthetic fuel output would have remained a fraction of Allied
Production. The geological distribution of petroleum reserves created an asymmetry that shaped everything that followed. This wasn't a story where hard work and determination could equalize outcomes. It was a story where starting conditions, petroleum versus coal, existing refining capacity versus synthesis infrastructure that needed building, access to global resources versus blockade and isolation, created advantages that compounded over time. Germany fought skillfully within constraints that grew tighter monthly. The Luftwaffe achieved remarkable results given fuel limitations, but those limitations prevented matching Allied air forces that operated without comparable constraints. The irony cuts multiple ways. Germany pioneered coal synthesis technology that could have provided petroleum-poor nations with liquid fuel independence. Under different circumstances, this represented a strategic breakthrough. But the circumstances that forced Germany to pursue coal synthesis, lack of petroleum reserves, also made the process economically inefficient compared to conventional refining. The technology worked, but couldn't compete with alternatives available to nations with petroleum access. Germany solved the chemistry problem, but couldn't overcome the energy economics problem. American petroleum engineers solved different problems: how to extract maximum high-octane yield from existing crude, how to build refining capacity at unprecedented scales, how to distribute fuel across global supply chains. These problems were equally difficult in their domains, requiring innovation and industrial mobilization of extraordinary scope. But they started from abundance rather than scarcity, and that starting point made all the difference. The legacy endures in unexpected places. Modern synthetic fuel research still grapples with the same thermodynamic constraints that limited German coal synthesis. Fischer-Tropsch processes continue operating in South Africa and other locations where specific conditions justify the economics.
catalytic cracking remains fundamental to petroleum refining worldwide. The chemical knowledge developed under wartime pressure shaped peacetime industries. The technical accomplishments outlasted the strategic context that drove them. For those who lived through it, the pilots who flew, the engineers who designed, the workers who refined, the logisticians who distributed, the fuel story was simultaneously central and invisible. Central because nothing flew without fuel. Invisible because once fuel arrived reliably, attention shifted to visible elements like aircraft and tactics. The asymmetry only became visible when fuel disappeared, when missions couldn't fly, when training couldn't occur, when the material constraints became impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.